Although elected as a Republican last year, Mr. Trump has shown in the nearly 8 months in office that he is in many ways the first independent to hold the presidency since the advent of the current two-party system around the time of the Civil War. Which is not my opinion. That is a statement from Peter Baker of the New York Times, he wrote an interesting op-ed where he said that Donald Trump is independent. This is interesting because this morning, I saw a tweet from Jay Rosen, who is an NYU professor, media critic, commentator, whatever you want to call him, where he showed that the Washington Post, followed by the Associated Press, followed by the New York Times, all just one at a time wrote this story about Donald Trump being an independent. And it got me wondering about why does the media so regularly just fall in line and say the same thing over and over again? Following Charlottesville, every media company criticized Trump as though he did not condemn violence. They all seem to be in agreement with each other. Before we get into the media criticism, let's talk about why they're calling Donald Trump an independent. This has to do with a deal he made with Democratic congressional leaders about hurricane relief. They wanted to extend the debt ceiling for a few months, avoid a default or a shutdown, and in exchange, there would be relief provided to Hurricane Harvey victims, right? So we're dealing with the aftermath of a Category 4 hurricane in Houston, and we're currently dealing with ongoing damage from another Category 4 hurricane, Irma, in Florida. Donald Trump wanted to make a deal so that these resources would be available to those who were made victims of these disasters, and this is what we end up with. These articles talk about how the Republican Party is angry. It's much to the ire of the Republicans Trump has done this deal. But is it really surprising to anybody, I mean, who's on YouTube or who's in the alternative space, that Donald Trump would do this deal? I've covered a ton of Trump rallies and I was at many of his events throughout the election. I talked to a lot of people, and most of the people that I talked with tended to be independent. They told me things like they never voted before. Many of these people said they were Reagan Democrats. They were Democrats, but they wanted an outsider. Trump was seen as an anti-establishment candidate. 12% of Bernie voters even voted for Donald Trump. We heard stories about how certain areas of the country with low voter turnout had all of a sudden lit up red that they were coming out to vote for Donald Trump. So why is it now, nearly 8 months after Trump already won, that these journalists are saying Donald Trump is an independent? Is it that they're just towing the line? Is there groupthink within these media companies? This reminds me of these videos Conan O'Brien used to do, where he would show all of these news anchors saying the exact same thing.
Who are you really shopping for this holiday season? It's okay, you can admit it, if you've bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
Well, it's okay, you can admit it if you have bought an item or 2 or maybe 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. You've bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
The reality is, these people all have teleprompters that were written in one place and then distributed amongst all of these local outlets, which is kind of weird and kind of scary when you realize that the people you're seeing on TV are not genuine. These are people who are just paid to speak because they're good at reading and speaking at the same time. Now, they do say things that are their own thoughts and ideas, obviously, but a lot of the script, a lot of the narrative we see comes from wire services, where someone will write a story, publish it, and then someone else will write the same thing. I get a lot of people that say, Tim, you're so articulate. How do you do these videos? Do you have a teleprompter? Do you write a script? And the answer is no. I don't have a script. I don't write a script. I just talk to the camera. You may notice there are a bunch of jump cuts in this video because sometimes I'll stutter, I'll stammer, or I'll pause for a second to think about things. But usually I know what I want to talk about. I know the stories because I do the research, and then I just turn the camera on and I will talk. Some of the videos I've done, I've talked straight for 15 minutes with no jump cuts. Usually I'll put some jump cuts in because I want to cut it down for time, or sometimes I just plain screw up and have to cut it out. Now, when it comes to these op-eds saying Donald Trump is independent, I think there is an aspect where a lot of these people, a lot of these journalists, they tend to be in big cities, they surround themselves with each other, and they all share the same opinions. They read the same things, they talk about the same things, and so they don't really see what's going on a ground level, or they especially don't see what's happening in the alternative media space. But there's also an aspect of people being scared to speak out of line. Is calling Donald Trump an independent a safe thing to do? Is it socially acceptable? Well, the Washington Post comes out with a story. Other journalists see that and they say, hey, they're not getting their head chewed off. I think I'll publish my story too. And then one by one, people start popping out stories that are very similar. Nobody wants to be the first person to come out and find out that what they said was not socially acceptable and then risk their careers. We can look at what happens with Google, YouTube, and these other social media platforms, that if you say things that are out of line, they come for you. So these big media companies, somebody writes an op-ed, and then they publish it, and then everyone else says, hey, this is socially acceptable now. And that's why I think independent media is so goddamn important. Because if we're going to listen to the big newspapers, right, New York Times, AP, Washington Post doing these stories, we're going to hear the exact same opinions. We're going to see basically the same stories. If we start looking to partisan news outlets, it's even worse, because then they just take only one side of the story and they shrink the story down, add some analysis, and then just tell you some partisan nonsense. This is why I'm so grateful for people like Dave Rubin and Philip DeFranco. When I watch them, and I don't know this for sure, but I get the feeling that I know what their agenda is, and their agenda is honesty and understanding. And I feel an affinity for that because that's kind of where I'm at. I don't have a political agenda, and I don't think that Dave or Phil do it either. I think it's simply about better understanding how the world works and then being honest about why these things are happening. So when people say things to me like, Tim, you're unbiased, you're the only objective journalist, I never believe that. I don't think that's true. I think there are some instances where you can be objective, and there are some instances where you can't be. People often confuse omniscience with objectivity. They say that there's no way to know everything, so you can't truly be objective. And I think that's a total cop-out. You know, Glenn Greenwald says this. There's no such thing as objective journalism. And that is a lie. That is not true. Look, I got a lot of respect for Glenn Greenwald, but in this instance, he's dead wrong. Let me explain objectivity to you. If I go out in the street and I see somebody punch somebody else and I don't know them, and you ask me what happens, I can objectively say, that dude punched that dude. However, if one of those guys is my brother, I cannot be objective. I'm going to say, that guy's attacking my brother. So there's a difference between objectivity and omniscience. One of the problems of this idea, and a big problem with this media groupthink, is that people can't be reasonable. Let's look at Charlottesville, for example. Donald Trump came out and said that there was violence on many sides. That is a factual statement, there was. But it wasn't the opinion that people wanted to hear. Donald Trump came out again and said that racism is evil, and he condemned neo-Nazis.
Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans.
But that got overlooked because he condemned violence on all sides. The people in the media wanted to push a narrative, and they all agreed with the same thing. Where was the challenge? Where were the people within these own news organizations to say we don't all hold the exact same opinions? Or is it that these media organizations have an agenda? They say, here's what we're going to say and here's what we're going to believe, and no one can deviate from that, which is problematic. The worst part about this is, when the media says things that are unreasonable, it makes me have to defend people I don't like. I don't like politicians. I do not agree with Donald Trump's policies. I don't agree with Hillary Clinton's policies. I don't agree with most of these politicians' policies, and I don't want to have to stick up for them. But I also feel like if we're not reasonable about what the arguments are, we can't prove them wrong. In the instance where people are finally now coming out and saying that Donald Trump is independent, yeah, people knew that. Why didn't you say that a long time ago? There are pros and there are cons to how the media works. There's a lot of people who just watch the mainstream media, and they believe whatever is said. And this is problematic because, yes, very often the mainstream media puts out bad information, poorly sourced information, and has to issue a correction. Most people don't see the correction. They just see the bad story. So what ends up happening is, if the mainstream media puts out a story to hundreds of millions of people and it's wrong, they're going to believe that for a very, very long time. When the mainstream media puts out homogenous opinion, it just puts people in that same bucket where they're just going to, it's the only opinion they're going to hear from the mainstream media, and they're going to fall in line with it. There are benefits, however, to these large news organizations. They have more resources, they can investigate, they can spend money on big investigative pieces, and they can fact check. So very often, they will get things right. Yes, I think more often than not, the mainstream media and the big news organizations get things right because they have to, it's part of their business. Now, when it comes to alternative media, there's also pros and there's cons. There's the difference in opinion. You can watch someone else and hear what someone else thinks and get away from this groupthink. But at the same time, although you can hear alternative opinions or challenges to the mainstream narrative, you also get people who might dig a little too far and go into poorly sourced websites that have good intentions but kind of put out bad info, which leads to wacky stuff like crazy conspiracy theories. And then if you get really, really far off the deep end, people who dig too deep end up believing there's like giant green aliens who are trying to steal our gold or something. The other issue is that a lot of these companies are just going to say what they think is socially acceptable. Nobody wants to have a controversial opinion or step out of line. They want to make sure that they can keep their jobs, keep their head low, and just say what's safe. That's another big problem. People need to be fearless. They need to be able to come out and say, no, this is what's happening, and I don't care what the results are. Unfortunately, when we look at things like, James Damore, who stood up and put out a document which was based by a lot of scientific fact mixed with his opinion, he gets fired for it. He gets criticized for it. He gets called alt-right. He gets called a white supremacist, other crazy names, simply for saying, hey guys, I disagree. And this is one of the big problems with where our society is headed. Media needs to be diversified in its opinion. And we need to be able to say, you know what? I'm willing to say this regardless of the ramifications because it needs to be said. The only agenda that I care about is freedom of speech and freedom of expression, because we need to be able to hear a multitude of thoughts so we can, look at the data, look at what people are thinking, we can explore new ideas, we can expand our horizons, and then make the decisions that are appropriate. This conversation's fantastic. It leads into why alternative media is so important. It leads into why Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, is so important. It's scary to see PayPal, Patreon, whatever, these payment processing companies that are shutting down people's incomes based on their political opinion. And so cryptocurrency becomes very valuable in this instance because even if the big companies want to shut you down, a decentralized way to exchange value is going to help people with diverse opinions be able to speak out without being silenced. Though they may lose their platforms, they will still receive the funding should they find an alternative means of doing so. This is why I like mines a lot, because decentralization could be really, really important in the future. But let me know what you think. I mean, you watch my channel, so I assume you appreciate alternative forms of media, you like YouTube. Comment below and we'll keep the conversation going. If you like the video, click the like button. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram @TimCast. If you want to support the work that I do, make sure you go to timcast.com/donate. Give whatever you'd like or give nothing at all. My videos are always free and available every single day at 4 p.m. Stay tuned for periodic live streams. There should be one tonight around 8 p.m. And breaking news from around the world. Right now, I'm looking into the best place to go. Something interesting happened, though. There's a forecast model, a couple of them, that show Hurricane Jose hitting the East Coast, hitting New York. Well, that'll probably change, it's 10 days out, but we'll see what happens. With that, I will say thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned. I'll see you tomorrow.